"The best birthday gift would be your death," my daughter said, smiling as if she'd just blown out candles and made a wish. I didn't drop my fork. I didn't gasp. I simply looked at her, really looked at her, as the soft glow of string lights reflected in her eyes, and for the first time in 35 years, I realized I did not recognize the woman sitting across from me. The restaurant was one of those upscale places downtown, all polished wood and low jazz humming through hidden speakers, the kind of place Emily loved because it made her feel important. I had arrived early, as I always did, wearing the navy dress she once told me made me look put together, though she hadn't said anything like that in years. When she walked in, she didn't hug me. She kissed the air beside my cheek and checked her phone before even sitting down. That was the first sign. The second was the way her friends looked at me when they joined us halfway through dinner, polite but distant, like I was a stranger who had wandered into a private event. I watched her laugh with them, watched the way she leaned in, confident and bright, her hand resting on the table like everything in her life was exactly where it should be. And maybe it was. Maybe that was the problem. When the waiter brought out her cake, a delicate thing with white frosting and gold trim, everyone clapped. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, making her wish, and when she opened them, she looked directly at me. That was when she said it. Calm, clear, measured. Not a joke. Not even disguised as one. Her friends laughed nervously, one of them saying something about dark humor, but Emily didn't laugh. She just took a sip of her champagne and held my gaze like she was waiting for me to react. I didn't. I picked up my napkin, folded it once, and placed it beside my plate. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady enough to surprise even me. Inside, something had shifted. Not broken. Shifted. Like a door I hadn't noticed before had quietly opened somewhere deep in my chest. I stayed through dessert. I paid the bill. Of course I did. I even thanked her friends for coming, wished them a safe drive home the same way I had done for years, the same small courtesies that had defined my life as her mother. Emily didn't walk me to my car. She had another party to go to, she said. More people to see. More celebrating to do. I stood in the parking lot for a moment after she left, the night air cool against my skin, and listened to the fading sound of her laughter as it disappeared into the city. Then I got into my car, closed the door and sat there in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just sat with the echo of her words, turning them over slowly, carefully, like they were something fragile that needed to be understood before it could be put away. Because that hadn't been anger. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been intention. And intention changes everything. By the time I turned the key in the ignition, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. My daughter hadn't just made a wish that night. She had revealed a plan, and I was going to find out exactly what it was. I did not drive home right away. Instead, I circled the block twice, passing the same quiet storefronts and dim streetlights, letting the rhythm of the road steady my thoughts. By the time I finally pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly as I had left it that morning, calm and still as if nothing had changed. But something had. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside and paused in the entryway listening. The refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen. The clock on the wall ticked in slow, even beats. Everything felt ordinary, and yet I knew with absolute certainty that nothing about my life was ordinary anymore. I set my purse down on the hallway table and slipped off my shoes, placing them neatly side by side, the way I had done every evening for years. Routine had always comforted me. Tonight it felt like a test. I moved through the house slowly, turning on lights one by one, as if I were seeing each room for the first time. The living room still held the same cream-colored sofa, the same framed photographs of Emily growing up, her school portraits lined up in perfect order along the mantel. There she was at 8 years old, missing her front teeth, grinning at the camera. There she was at 16, holding her driver license with pride. There she was at 22, standing beside me on her college graduation day, her arm looped through mine, her smile wide and genuine. I stopped there for a moment studying that photograph. Back then she had leaned into me. Back then she had needed me. I reached out and adjusted the frame slightly, even though it was already straight. Then I turned away and walked into the kitchen. I did not pour myself a drink. I did not sit down. Instead, I went directly to the drawer beside the refrigerator and took out a small stack of unopened mail, bills, statements, Notices I had been meaning to sort through but never quite found the time for. I carried them to the table and spread them out in front of me. At first everything looked normal. Utility bills, insurance reminders, a credit card statement I recognized. But then I saw it. An envelope from the bank, thicker than the others, addressed to both of us. I frowned slightly, running my finger along the edge before opening it carefully. Inside was a statement I had not expected. A summary of transactions from a joint account I rarely used anymore, one I had kept open years ago for convenience, back when Emily was still in college and needed occasional help. I scanned the numbers once, then again, slower this time. Large withdrawals, frequent transfers, payments I did not recognize. My name was on the account, but I had not authorized any of this. I felt a quiet stillness settle over me, deeper than before. Not panic, not anger. Something clearer. I reached for my reading glasses, put them on, and read every line carefully, tracing each transaction as if it were a thread leading somewhere I needed to go. The date stretched back months, maybe longer. This was not new. This had been happening for some time. I leaned back slightly in my chair, the paper still in my hands, and let the realization take its full shape. Tonight had not been the beginning. It had been the confirmation. I folded the statement neatly and placed it in front of me, aligning it with the edge of the table. Then I reached for my phone. I did not call Emily. I did not leave a message. Instead, I opened my calendar and began making a list. Bank, lawyer, mortgage office. 3 stops. That was all it would take to understand everything. I set the phone down and looked around the kitchen one more time, at the clean counters, the quiet appliances, the life I had built piece by piece over decades. For years I had believed that love meant trust without question. Tonight I understood something different. Trust was not something you gave away forever. It was something you had to be willing to take back when it was no longer deserved. And as I sat there in the soft light of my kitchen, I realized that I had already begun. The next morning began like any other, quiet and predictable, the kind of morning I used to take comfort in. I woke up at 6:30 without an alarm, as I always did, and for a brief moment, I lay still in bed, listening to the faint sound of birds outside my window. The world had not changed overnight. The sun still rose. The street outside would soon fill with the usual passing cars. But inside me, something had settled into place with a clarity I had not felt in years. I got up, made my bed carefully, smoothing the sheets as if precision mattered more now than ever, then walked into the kitchen and brewed a pot of coffee. I did not rush. There was no need to. Every movement I made felt deliberate, measured, as though I had stepped into a role I had been preparing for without realizing it. I poured myself a cup, added a small splash of cream, and carried it to the table where the bank statement still lay exactly where I had left it. I sat down, took a sip, and read through it one more time, slower than before, letting each number confirm what I already knew. This was not carelessness. This was design. I reached for my phone and dialed the bank the moment they opened. The representative on the other end sounded young, polite, and slightly rushed, the way people often do at the start of their workday. I gave her my information, my voice calm and even, and asked her to walk me through the recent activity on the account. There was a brief pause as she pulled up the records, then the sound of typing. "Yes, ma'am," she said after a moment. "These transfers were all authorized using your joint account credentials." I let that sit between us for a second. "And the second name on the account?" I asked. "Emily Collins," she confirmed. "Of course." I thanked her, asked a few more precise questions about access, authorization, and limits, and ended the call without raising my voice once. There was no need for emotion. Emotion would not change the facts. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and placed it in the dishwasher. Then I went to the hallway closet and took out a small folder I had not opened in years. Inside were documents I had kept out of habit rather than necessity, papers tied to the house, the original purchase agreement, the mortgage details, the legal structure of ownership. I carried the folder back to the table and opened it slowly, the faint smell of paper and ink rising as I flipped through each page. My name was there, not just alongside hers. Mine stood first. Primary holder. Sole authority on several key decisions that I had never thought to revisit because I had trusted that I would never need to. I closed the folder gently and placed my hand on top of it, feeling the weight of something that was no longer just paperwork. It was leverage. Across the room, the morning light had begun to fill the space, casting soft shadows across the floor, touching the edges of the photographs, the furniture, the quiet life I had built. For years, I had believed that maintaining peace meant overlooking small things, that love required patience even when it was not returned in equal measure. But patience, I was beginning to understand, has a limit. And once that limit is reached, what follows is not chaos. It is clarity. I stood up, gathered the statement and the folder, and placed them neatly into my bag. Then I checked the time. 8:15. The bank would be open. The lawyer would be in by 9. And by the end of the morning, I intended to have answers that could not be undone. I turned off the kitchen light as I walked out, not because I needed to, but because I had always done it that way. Some habits remain. Others I was ready to leave behind. I arrived at the bank at 8:23. A few minutes after the doors had opened, and stepped inside with the same steady pace I had used for years, as if I were simply there to handle something routine. The lobby was quiet, the air cool and faintly scented with polished floors and fresh paper, and a young teller greeted me with a practiced smile that did not quite reach her eyes. I returned it politely and asked to speak with someone about my account. Within minutes, I was seated across from a man in a neatly pressed suit who introduced himself as Daniel, his tone professional, attentive, and slightly cautious in the way people become when they sense something beneath the surface. I placed the statement on the desk between us, smoothing it flat with my palm, and asked him to walk me through every transaction again, this time in person. He did not question me. He simply nodded and began, pointing to each line, explaining dates, amounts, authorization methods. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my posture straight, my expression calm. When he finished, I asked him one question. If I wanted to restrict access to this account immediately, could I? He hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough to confirm that what I was asking was unusual, then replied carefully, "Yes, ma'am, as the primary account holder, you have full authority to make changes." Primary. The word settled quietly between us. I nodded once. "Then I would like to proceed," I said. The rest unfolded quickly. Forms were printed. Signatures were placed. Access was limited, then removed. I did not rush, but I did not linger either. Each step was completed with a precision that surprised even me. As if I had always known how to do this and had simply been waiting for the moment to begin. When it was done, Daniel looked at me with a different expression than before, something closer to respect than routine politeness. "Is there anything else I can assist you with today?" he asked. I paused for a moment, considering, then nodded slightly. "Yes," I said. "I would like to transfer the remaining balance into a new account under my name only." He did not ask why. He simply turned back to his computer and began typing. Within minutes it was finished. Clean. Final. Irreversible. I thanked him, gathered my papers, and stood up. As I walked out of the bank, the morning sun felt warmer than it had earlier, the light sharper, as if the world itself had shifted into clearer focus. I did not check my phone. I did not wonder if Emily had noticed yet. That was not important. What mattered was that the first step had been taken, and it had been taken quietly, without confrontation, without explanation. I got into my car and sat for a moment with my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, feeling the absence of something I had carried for a long time without realizing it. Obligation. That was the word. It had been there for years, woven into every decision, every compromise, every moment I had chosen her comfort over my own. And now it was gone. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, already knowing where I was going next. The lawyer's office was 10 minutes away, located in a modest building on the edge of downtown, the kind of place that did not draw attention to itself but handled matters that changed lives all the same. As I drove, I thought briefly of the girl in the photograph on my mantle, the one with the bright smile and the missing teeth, and I allowed myself a single quiet breath. Then I let that image go. Because the woman I was dealing with now was not that child. And the decisions I was about to make could not be guided by memories that no longer belonged to the present. I pulled into the parking lot of the law office at 8:57 and turned off the engine, letting the quiet settle around me before I stepped out of the car. The building itself was unremarkable. A two-story structure with clean windows and a modest sign near the entrance, But I had chosen this place years ago for a reason. Discretion. Precision. No unnecessary questions. I walked inside and gave my name to the receptionist, who recognized me immediately and offered a polite nod before asking me to take a seat. I did not wait long. Within minutes, I was shown into a corner office where Mr. Harrison stood as I entered. His expression warm but measured, the way it had always been. He had handled several matters for me in the past, small things mostly. Documents, updates, quiet arrangements that never required urgency. Today felt different. I took a seat across from his desk and placed my folder in front of him without hesitation. I need to review everything connected to my house, I said, my voice steady, clear. He did not ask why. He simply opened the folder and began reading, his eyes moving carefully across each page, occasionally adjusting his glasses as he went. The room was silent except for the faint turning of paper. After a few minutes, he leaned back slightly and looked at me with a focus that told me he understood more than I had said. You are listed as the primary legal owner, he said. Your daughter is included in a secondary capacity, but she does not have unilateral control over the property. I nodded once. That confirmed what I had already seen, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a different way. And the mortgage? I asked. He flipped to another section, scanning quickly. The loan is tied to your name first. Any major decisions regarding it require your authorization. Again, the word settled quietly into place. Authorization. I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the calm return, deeper now, more grounded. If I chose to make changes to the loan, I said, or even cancel it entirely, what would that require? He studied me for a moment, not with suspicion, but with careful attention, as if measuring the weight of my question. It would require formal notice, documentation, and immediate financial adjustment, he replied. But legally, you have the authority to do so. I let out a slow breath, not because I was uncertain, but because I was confirming the final piece of something that had already begun to take shape. And access to the property? I continued. Could I restrict it if necessary? He nodded without hesitation. Yes. As the primary owner, you can determine who has the right to reside there. There it was. Not emotion. Not interpretation. Fact. I reached into my bag and took out the bank statement, placing it beside the folder. There have been financial activities I did not authorize, I said simply. He glanced at the document, his expression sharpening slightly as he read through the numbers, the pattern becoming clear even without explanation. When he looked back at me, there was no surprise in his eyes, only understanding. Then I would advise acting quickly, he said. I gave a small nod. I intend to. We discussed the steps in detail after that, each one precise, structured, and entirely within my control. There was no raised voice, no dramatic declaration, only a quiet alignment of actions that would shift everything without warning. When I stood to leave, Mr. Harrison walked me to the door, his tone respectful, his manner unchanged, but there was something different in the way he held eye contact for just a moment longer than usual. As I stepped back into the hallway, I felt it again, that same clarity that had settled over me earlier, now stronger, more defined. This was no longer about understanding what had happened. That part was already complete. This was about what came next. And for the first time in a very long time, every step ahead of me belonged entirely to me. I left the office just after 10:30, the folder now closed and secured in my bag, not because I needed to review it again, but because everything inside it had already settled into certainty. The air outside felt different than it had earlier that morning, warmer, brighter, but not in a way that distracted me. If anything, it sharpened my focus. I walked to my car without rushing, unlocked the door, and sat down with the same steady composure I had carried since the night before. For a moment I allowed myself to sit still, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, feeling the quiet weight of what had just been confirmed. Then I reached into my bag, took out my phone and began the next step. The mortgage office answered on the second ring, a polite voice greeting me with practiced efficiency. I introduced myself, gave the account number, and stated clearly that I needed to discuss the current status of the loan attached to my property. There was a brief pause as the representative pulled up my information, followed by the soft clicking of keys. Yes, Miss Collins, she said. I see your account here. How may I assist you today? I did not hesitate. I would like to initiate the process to terminate the loan, I said, my tone even controlled. Another pause, slightly longer this time. Are you certain? She asked carefully. There are procedures involved and we will need to verify. I understand, I replied, not raising my voice, not interrupting, simply placing the words exactly where they needed to be. Please proceed. What followed was a series of confirmations, identity checks, and procedural explanations, each one handled with the same calm precision I had used all morning. I listened. I answered. I signed electronically when required. There was no confusion, no hesitation. Within the hour, the process had begun, and more importantly, it had been documented. I ended the call with a quiet thank you and placed the phone back into my bag. Then I started the engine. The drive home felt shorter than usual, as if time itself had adjusted to match the pace of my decisions. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had, unchanged, familiar, still carrying the same quiet presence it had held for years. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing briefly through the hallway. I did not wander this time. I moved with purpose. Into the bedroom. To the closet. I pulled down a suitcase from the top shelf, setting it carefully on the bed. It had not been used in a long time, but it was clean, well kept, ready. I opened it slowly and began placing items inside, one at a time, choosing only what I needed, nothing more. A few changes of clothes. Personal documents. A small jewelry case. I did not pack in a hurry. Each item was selected with intention, as if I were assembling not just belongings, but the outline of a life that would continue without interruption, simply in a different place. The house remained quiet around me, the same ticking clock, the same faint hum of appliances, but now it felt less like a space I belonged to and more like a place I was passing through for the last time. When I finished, I closed the suitcase and set it by the door. Then I walked into the living room and stood for a moment, looking at the photographs again, at the years they represented, the moments I had preserved, the story I had believed in for so long. I did not take any of them down. I did not rearrange anything. I simply looked, then turned away. Because what mattered now was not what had been, but what I had already set into motion. And by the time Emily realized it, there would be nothing left for her to control. I did not leave immediately. Instead, I moved through the house one last time, not to say goodbye, but to make sure everything was exactly where it needed to be. The suitcase stood by the front door, quiet and patient, but there was still one thing left to do. I walked into the study, a room Emily rarely used, and sat down at the desk where I had handled years of paperwork, bills, and small decisions that had quietly held this household together. The surface was clean, polished, almost untouched, except for a single lamp and a stack of unopened mail. I reached into my bag and took out a sheet of thick, cream-colored paper, the kind I had always reserved for formal letters, and placed it in the center of the desk. For a moment I simply looked at it, my hands resting lightly on either side, feeling the stillness settle around me again. Then I picked up a pen and began to write. I did not rush. Each word was placed carefully, deliberately, as if it mattered not just what I said, but how it would be read when I was no longer there. I did not accuse. I did not explain everything. I did not need to. The truth had already been written in bank statements, in legal documents, in the quiet sequence of actions I had taken since the night before. What I left behind was something simpler, something that could not be argued with or rewritten. When I finished, I read it once slowly, ensuring that every sentence carried exactly the weight it was meant to hold. Then I folded the paper neatly and placed it inside an envelope, sealing it with a firm press of my fingers. I wrote her name on the front in the same handwriting she had seen her entire life. Emily. Nothing more. I set the envelope in the center of the desk, aligning it with the edge so that it would be the first thing she noticed when she walked into the room. After that, I did not linger. I turned off the lamp, stepped out into the hallway, and paused only long enough to glance once more toward the living room, where the photographs still stood untouched. Silent witnesses to a version of our life that no longer existed. Then I picked up my suitcase, opened the front door and stepped outside. The air was warmer now, the sun higher in the sky, casting long, clean lines of light across the driveway. I closed the door behind me and locked it, the sound sharp but final, echoing for just a moment before disappearing into the quiet neighborhood. I placed the suitcase in the trunk, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine without hesitation. There were no messages on my phone, no missed calls, no signs that anything had shifted yet. But I knew it would. Not because I had said anything, but because I had done everything. As I pulled away from the house, I did not look back. There was nothing behind me that required one last glance, no unfinished thought, no lingering doubt. What remained inside that house was no longer mine to carry. And what I had left on that desk would ensure that, for the first time, Emily would have to face something she could not control, could not dismiss, and could not undo. I drove for nearly an hour before I stopped, not because I was tired, but because I wanted distance, not just in miles but in feeling. The highway stretched ahead in long, steady lines, the kind that make you believe you can keep going without ever needing to turn back. When I finally pulled into a small rest area just outside the city limits, I parked beneath a row of tall trees and turned off the engine, letting the silence settle around me once again. It was different this time. Not heavy, not uncertain, just quiet. I reached into my bag and took out my phone, turning it over in my hand for a moment before unlocking it. There were 3 missed calls, all from Emily. The first had come about 20 minutes after I left the house. The second 10 minutes later. The third just a few minutes ago. No messages. That told me everything I needed to know. She had gone home. She had walked into the study. She had seen the envelope. I did not open the missed calls. I did not call her back. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the seat beside me and looked out through the windshield at the empty stretch of road ahead. For years I had answered every call she made, returned every message, adjusted my time, my plans, my life around the assumption that she needed me. But need is not the same as respect. And respect, once broken, does not return simply because someone demands it. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes for a brief moment, not to rest, but to let the final pieces fall into place. By now she would have read the letter. She would have seen the documents attached behind it, the copies I had made before leaving, each one marked, each one clear. The account no longer accessible. The funds no longer within reach. The loan no longer something she could rely on. Every assumption she had built her plans on had been quietly removed. Not taken in anger. Not ripped away in confrontation. Simply gone. I opened my eyes and reached for my phone again, this time checking the time. 11:42. Still no message. That meant she was not ready to speak. Or perhaps she did not know what to say. Either way, it did not matter. The conversation she expected to have, the one where she explained, justified, or redirected blame, was not going to happen. I had removed myself from that possibility the moment I walked out the door. Outside, a light breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint sound of leaves brushing together, soft and steady. I stepped out of the car and stood there for a moment, breathing in the air, feeling the space around me, the absence of tension that had quietly filled my life for so long. It was not relief. Not exactly. It was something quieter than that. Something steadier. I walked back to the driver's side, opened the door, and took one last look at my phone before setting it aside again. If she called again, it would ring. If she did not, it would remain silent. Either way, I would continue forward. Because for the first time, the direction of my life was no longer tied to her choices, her words, or her expectations. It was tied only to mine. And somewhere behind me, in a quiet house with a perfectly aligned envelope resting on a polished desk, my daughter was beginning to understand exactly what that meant. I got back into the car and merged onto the highway again, the steady motion of traffic carrying me forward without resistance, as if the road itself understood that there was no reason to slow down anymore. The city faded behind me mile by mile, replaced by long stretches of open space, quiet exits, and unfamiliar signs that no longer felt intimidating but freeing. I drove until the skyline disappeared completely, until the places I recognized were replaced by ones that held no history, no expectations, no memories attached to them. After some time, I exited near a small town I had never visited before, the kind of place where people moved at a slower pace and no one asked unnecessary questions. I found a modest hotel just off the main road, clean, simple, with a front desk clerk who greeted me with a polite nod and handed me a key without looking twice at my name. The room was quiet, neutral, untouched by anything that had come before me. I set my suitcase on the bed and walked over to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly to let in the soft afternoon light. For the first time since the night before, I allowed myself to sit down, not out of exhaustion, but because there was nothing left to prepare for. Everything had already been set into motion. I reached for my phone again, turning it on this time and watching the screen light up in my hand. There were more missed calls now. 5. Then 6. A message notification appeared just beneath them. I opened it without hesitation. It was from Emily. Short. Direct. What did you do? I read it once, then again, not because I needed to understand the words, but because I wanted to feel how little they affected me now. There was no apology. No confusión. Only accusation. That told me everything I needed to know. I did not respond. Instead, I opened the envelope I had prepared for myself, a copy of what I had left behind, and unfolded the letter carefully. My handwriting looked steady, almost detached, as if it had been written by someone who had already stepped outside of the situation entirely. I read the words again, letting them settle into the quiet of the room. I had not been cruel. I had not been emotional. I had simply told the truth, that the accounts were no longer accessible, that the house was no longer hers to assume control over, that the decision she had made without me would now have consequences she could not avoid. And at the end, one final line. Simple. Direct. You asked for a gift. This is the only one I can give you. I folded the letter again and placed it back into the envelope, setting it gently on the nightstand beside me. Outside, the afternoon continued as if nothing had changed, cars passing, people moving through their routines, the world carrying on in its quiet, predictable way. But inside that house I had left behind, nothing would feel predictable anymore. Every assumption Emily had relied on had been removed. Every certainty had been replaced with something she could not control. And for the first time in her life, she would have to face the reality of her choices without the safety net she had always expected me to provide. I leaned back against the headboard and closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to settle into the stillness that had finally replaced the noise. There was no anger left in me. No need to revisit what had already been done. Only a quiet understanding that some relationships do not end with a conversation. They end with a decision. And I had already made mine.